Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today we'll be discussing the first Secretary of War for the United States. Today's subject is, of course, Henry Knox. Now, Henry Knox had to take over as the man of the family at just 12 years old when his father passed away. And to do this, he became an apprentice to a local bookseller. And this worked out swimmingly for him because by the age of 20, he opened his own bookstore, which is very interesting because this is just after the Stamp Act came and went, and it would have been very difficult to sell books if the Stamp Act was still around. So Knox was very early on attracted to the Patriot cause because he was in Boston, the heart of where the rabble was being roused. But many of the people Knox sold books to were British soldiers who were occupying the city. Now, Knox was a big fan of reading about and talking about military tactics, history, strategy, and he learned from these soldiers a lot about things like artillery, which would come in very handy in the future. So, Knox would, in 1775, after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, Knox was still just 25 years old, but he and his young wife Lucy snuck out of Boston and joined the Patriot cause. Now, Artemus Ward, who was the default first commander-in-chief, as I've discussed before, he instructed Knox to run the artillery during the Battle of Bunker Hill. And he impressed Knox, Knox impressed Ward, and when George Washington showed up, those two became very fast friends, and he also impressed George Washington. So Knox said, hey, we just captured Fort Ticonderoga, and there's a bunch of cannons up there. Do you want me to go get them and bring them back here to the siege of Boston? And Washington said, sure, go ahead. Now, this task was a lot more difficult than it seemed. When he got to outside Albany and Fort Ticonderoga, Henry Knox selected approximately 59 cannons that weighed about 60 tons. So he and his men commandeered some local oxen and dragged it back to Boston. It's a very long trip in the middle of winter over frozen lakes and icy rivers, and somehow he accomplished this amazing feat in just a brief time, 2 or 3 months, I believe. More like 2 months, if I'm not mistaken. And we're lucky he did, because it was these cannons that were used to fortify Dorchester Heights and really get the British to evacuate Boston so the Americans can take it back. And it was the first major American victory. I suppose you can count Lexington and Concord as a victory, but this was a serious victory. The British had occupied Boston. George Washington was sieging Boston for a year before Henry Knox's artillery helped kick them out. So Knox stayed with Washington throughout the war. He served in most major battles in the middle and northern, colonies or states. Didn't have a lot to do in the South, but he did go, and he was there at Yorktown when the war was won. And almost immediately after, a little while after, Washington basically takes his hands off, stops running the army. He ends up resigning. Now, when he stops running the army, Henry Knox is chosen to oversee the army in Washington's stead. And during this time, Henry Knox actually organizes the demobilization of the Continental Army. He's the one who shuts it down and sends everyone home. Very shortly after that, Henry Knox is appointed by the Confederation Congress, which was the new name of the Continental Congress after the Articles of Confederation. Henry Knox is chosen as the first Secretary of War. Now, there wasn't a whole lot of warring at this point. There was the Northwest Indian War, but not a whole lot for him to do until the Constitution is written a few years later and George Washington becomes president, and then he appoints Henry Knox to a position he already had, which was Secretary of War, but this time under the United States in Congress assembled under the new Constitution. And he holds this position for until 1795, so for about 6 years he works in this position. And then Knox retires to a farm up in Maine, where he may or may not have been the nicest landlord to his tenants, but he invested in a wide swath of different lumber, brick making, cattle raising. The list kind of goes on, shipbuilding. It's a very long list of things he invested in. Unfortunately, he ended up losing a lot of money because he diversified too much. That's neither here nor there. That's pretty much the life of Henry Knox, the bookseller who became the Secretary of War. If you have any questions, please leave them down below. If you like this video, please hit like. If you really like it, please hit subscribe. I'm going to put out another video tomorrow on Friday. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to talking to you tomorrow.